Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we're talking with Seth Lake about expense sharing and illegal charters, something all pilots need to understand in order to comply with the FARs. Last week in episode 233, we talked about advisory glide slopes found on some RNAV approaches, and I gave an update on the crash of a Cessna 208 Caravan in Burley, Idaho. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/233. And this is a listener-supported show. You know what that means. It's ad-free, but we really encourage you to sign up to become a member and support the show. You can do that by going to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, and when you do, I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, both pilots of an A330 were asleep in flight. The woman who knocked out a flight attendant's teeth was sentenced, and an FAA inspector admits to taking bribes and will tell you what he received. All this and more, and the news starts now. From theadvertiser.com, pilot disorientation and weather led to Lafayette plane crash that killed 5, according to the NTSB. The pilot of a plane that crashed in Lafayette, Louisiana, and killed 5 of the 6 people aboard in December 2019 became spatially disoriented and lost control of the plane, the NTSB concluded. The small passenger plane was bound for Atlanta to watch the LSU football team play a semifinal game in the Peach Bowl when it crashed on December 28, 2019, shortly after taking off from Lafayette Regional Airport. The crash killed the pilot and 4 passengers. A 5th passenger was treated for burns that covered 75% of his body. A bystander who was in the post office parking lot where the plane first made impact with the ground was also injured and suffered burns to 30% of her body. The NTSB wrote in its final report, quote, "In summary, post-accident examination of the airplane structures and systems revealed no anomalies that would have precluded normal operation. The weather conditions at the time of takeoff were conducive to the development of spatial disorientation. The lack of visual references and the plane's increasing pitch attitude likely caused the pilot to become spatially disoriented during the initial climb, as evidenced by the airplane's continuing and tightening turn to the left away from the intended course. Thus, the pilot's spatial disorientation led to his loss of control of the airplane." The Piper PA-31T was cleared by ATC to take off from the airport at 9:18 a.m., When it took off, it started by following the flight path given by ATC. The plane reached its highest altitude at 925 feet at 9:20 a.m. and crashed seconds later. There was no Mayday call. The survivor later told the investigator the airplane ride felt as he had experienced it before. He said the airplane pitched up like the pilot was trying to get above or over the clouds, and that a harder-than-normal pitching movement had occurred. Because of the low visibility, which the NTSB said was conducive to the development of spatial disorientation, and the survivor's description of the pitch of the plane, the NTSB said the pilot likely experienced spatial disorientation. The pilot, age 51, had about 1,530 hours of flight experience. About 730 of those were in the aircraft that crashed. The pilot had training in April 2019, but the instructor's CFI certificate had expired 2 months earlier. The NTSB said the pilot may not have been aware of the instructor pilot's expired license. Now, this particular accident ended in a descending left turn, and of course, many spatial disorientation accidents end in descending turns. Here's a key thing to remember about turns when you're in IMC, and it comes from the FAA's safety brochure on spatial disorientation. In talking about the semicircular canals in our ears, it says, "If you turn either your aircraft or your head, the canal moves with your head, but the fluid inside does not move because of its inertia. As the canal moves, the hairs inside also move with it and are bent in the opposite direction of the acceleration by the stationary fluid. This hair movement sends a signal to the brain to indicate that the head is turned. The problem starts when you continue turning your aircraft at a constant rate, as in a coordinated turn, for more than 20 seconds. In this kind of turn, the fluid inside the canal starts moving initially, then friction causes it to catch up with the walls of the rotating canal. When this happens, the hairs inside the canal will return to their straight-up position, sending an erroneous signal to the brain that the turn has stopped, when in fact the turn continues. If you then start rolling out of the turn to go back to level flight, The fluid inside the canal will continue to move because of its inertia, and the hairs will now move in the opposite direction, sending an erroneous signal to the brain, indicating that you are turning in the opposite direction, when in fact you are actually slowing down from the original turn. So just remember to watch your instruments and not rely on the false signals that you get from your ear to determine if you're straight and level or in a turn. From AOPA.org, Tragedy Halts Nebraska Short Takeoff and Landing Event. A Cessna 140 flown by California pilot Tom Defoe was taking part in a traditional short takeoff and landing heat on the second day of the May Day STOL 2022 competition at Wayne Municipal Airport in Wayne, Nebraska. The event had been planned to include 4 days of precision aviation competition. Winds were too strong to run the STOL drag heats, a hybrid test of speed and precision, measured by time and combined takeoff and landing distance. Defoe and other pilots took part in pickup heats of traditional STOL competition, where combined takeoff and landing distance is all that is measured. Those heats were not on the schedule. During the fourth heat, Defoe's Cessna rolled and dove during or soon after the base to final turn and struck the ground in view of shocked spectators. Pilots who witnessed the accident sequence estimated that it began about 400 feet above the ground, an altitude at which recovery would have been impossible. The emergency response was immediate, and all other activity on the airfield stopped in the moments following the incident at around 6:50 p.m. local time. From Fox6now.com, Wauwatosa plane crash, student dies from injury. A Brookfield, Wisconsin family is mourning the loss of a young man who died following a Wauwatosa plane crash on May 26. Daniel Perlman was 18. The Northwestern University student got his student pilot's license last fall, according to FAA records. Family said he'd only flown solo a couple of times and that his first solo flight was recorded just 4 weeks earlier. Medical examiner reports say that Perlman took off in a Cessna 152, did a pass at Timmerman Airport, and then a touch-and-go landing. Then there was trouble. The report says that he radioed in that he had engine problems and, quote, didn't know what to do. Perlman was the only one aboard the two-seater when it crashed in the backyard of a home just south of Timmerman. Perlman went to the hospital with multiple injuries but died 2 days later. Perlman's father said even in his son's passing, he saved several lives as an organ donor. The FAA and NTSB are investigating the crash. From GeneralAviationNews.com, fumbling with iPad leads to near-miss. This comes from a ASRS report, a NASA form in which a pilot wrote, I was on descent from 3,500 feet preparing to land at ZZZ, was on CTAF frequency, announced intentions, location, etc. Another aircraft was leaving the area in the direction I was flying in from, so I was very carefully scanning the sky in the direction of the airport, since I knew someone from there was headed at the precise location I was at. Looked down at my checklist on iPad and saw it was on the wrong page. Flipped it to the right page. This took approximately 10 seconds. When I looked back up, a plane was crossing ahead of me, right to left, same altitude climbing, approximately 300 feet away. Seems that as I was descending on about a 060 heading, it was climbing and turning left slowly, causing it to be out of my sight until it got close to my altitude. Visibility down and right is rather bad in a Cessna 182 since the door obscures the view. It was not the plane I was looking for from ZZZ, just some other plane that happened to be in the area and not on the CTAF frequency. We passed each other around 300 feet away. My main issues here, I concentrated too much of my scan on an area of the sky where I expected to see a plane, and I took my eyes off the sky for 10 seconds to fumble with an iPad. Corrective actions, switch back to paper checklist. They cannot flip to the wrong page and thus waste valuable eye time. From AOPA.org, FAA Aircraft Registration Issues, Long Delays and Expired Registrations. Calls concerning aircraft registration issues, both for initial applications and renewals, have been picking up recently. As of right now, the FAA Aircraft Registration Branch is processing paperwork received on approximately January 5th, 2022, so that would be about 5 months ago. This is causing issues with new aircraft registration applications, N-number changes, registration renewals, etc. The FAA has taken steps to help those with new registration applications that are expiring while waiting, only valid for 90 days, by providing extensions. Unfortunately, no relief has been forthcoming for those renewing the registrations or that have other registry requests for existing owners. So what can you do to make sure you don't end up in a situation where you're waiting for months for renewal with an aircraft you can't fly? Renew online. The FAA sends a notice out 6 months before the registration expiration date. In this notice, you're given an option online to renew, as well as instructions on how to renew by mail. An online renewal is processed much faster than a paper renewal, but it must be accomplished at least 2 months prior to the expiration date. Otherwise, you're going to have to renew by mail. Renew by mail, this should only be used if you absolutely do not have any other option, such as if you have an address change. Because the FAA is about 5 months behind in process, you would need to send your renewal in almost as soon as you get the notice in the mail. From generalaviationnews.com, distracted pilot hits skip loader while taxiing. This comes from a May 2020 NTSB report. The pilot reported that while taxiing for takeoff at the airport in Paris, California, he saw a skip loader on the immediate left edge of the taxiway and noted there was sufficient clearance to avoid it. However, during the taxi, his attention was distracted by setting up the GPS for the flight, and the Cessna 182 drifted left and hit the skip loader. The right horizontal stabilizer was substantially damaged. The pilot reported that there were no pre-accident mechanical failures or malfunctions with the airplane that would have precluded normal operation. Probable cause? The pilot's diverted attention while taxiing, which resulted in his failure to maintain clearance from the skip loader. And we've mentioned this a number of times before on the show. When I'm teaching, I always advocate that pilots, while taxiing, do nothing else but taxi. If they have to do something, such as enter a frequency or set up something on the GPS, they should stop their taxi until they're done. From generalaviationnews.com, pilot's shoe gets caught in rudder pedal. This comes from a May 2020 NTSB report. The pilot was performing an instrument approach to the runway at the airport in Ionia, Michigan, following a local flight. The Cessna 182 was configured with full flaps, and the pilot's intention was to perform a 3-point landing. Note this was a Cessna 182A with a tailwheel conversion kit installed. The wind was reported as calm. However, the pilot reported seeing smoke that indicated there was a light crosswind from the right. After touching down on the runway, the tailwheel began to shimmy violently, and the plane began to drift to the left. He applied rudder to get the airplane to track a straight path and then turned right to correct back to the runway's centerline. To recorrect to the centerline, he applied full left rudder. At that point, either the pilot's left shoe caught on something and jammed the pedal, or the left rudder pedal became stuck in the full left rudder position. He couldn't move the pedal to maintain directional control, and the plane ground looped, causing substantial damage to the right aileron and the right elevator. A post-accident examination showed no pre-accident mechanical malfunctions or failures with the airplane that would have precluded normal operations. Probable cause? The pilot's failure to maintain directional control during landing. Contributing was the pilot getting his shoe caught in the rudder pedal. And I'm always very careful with anything that I put down near my feet. Just the other day, I removed a water bottle because I was concerned that it might possibly get stuck in the rudder pedal. So be careful what you have down there. From mentorpilot.com, ITA A330 loss of comms with asleep pilots. By the way, you may know ITA Airways better by its old name of Alitalia. Here's the story. ATC couldn't talk to an ITA Airways Airbus A330 for 10 minutes because both flight crew members were reportedly asleep. The incident happened on May 1st of this year, involving an ITA Airways flight from New York's JFK Airport to Rome. The crew had crossed the Atlantic, reached Europe, and were overflying France when it happened. The flight was at flight level 380, about 200 nautical miles northwest of the city of Marseille in France, when a controller handed it off to Marseille Center. It's not clear if a pilot on the flight acknowledged the handoff to the new radio frequency, but it appears that the ATC at both centers could not talk to the ITA A330 flight for 10 minutes. ATC forwarded this information to military authorities who prepared to launch fighter aircraft. However, the issue ended relatively quickly. Before the fighters could intercept the aircraft, communications with ATC were restored. The flight continued uneventfully to Italy, landing in Rome safely. But this would not be the end of the story. Recent reports in Italian media suggest that ITA Airways has dismissed the captain of this A330 flight. An internal investigation determined that the captain was asleep at the time of the incident. The first officer was also asleep, but this crew member had the approval to do so. This is a process called controlled rest. Crew members in EASA countries can sleep during the cruise portion of the flight with specific conditions and limitations. It appears that ITA Airways did not accept the explanation that the A330 captain gave for the 10-minute loss of communication. The investigation into the incident determined that the captain's responses showed inconsistencies. The captain claimed that there was a fault with the radios that maintenance crews could not find or replicate. Again, the aircraft was at cruise altitude and on autopilot at the time of the incident. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, woman who knocked out flight attendant's teeth ends up with a 15-month prison sentence. A woman who violently assaulted a Southwest Airlines flight attendant because she was asked to put her seatbelt on before landing has finally been sentenced to a 15-month prison sentence and will have to pay more than $33,000 in restitution and fines. Vivian Quinones of Sacramento pleaded guilty to interfering with a Southwest Airlines flight attendant late last year, but her sentencing was delayed so the court could deal with a separate DUI charge. As part of a plea deal, prosecutors had originally sought just 4 months imprisonment for the May 2021 assault aboard a Southwest flight from Sacramento to San Diego. The incident went viral after cell phone footage of Quinones lashing out at the flight attendant was made public. Shortly before landing in San Diego, Quinones was asked to fasten her seatbelt, latch her tray table, and wear her face mask correctly. Quinones spoke back to the flight attendant before standing up and repeatedly punching her in the face. The flight attendant suffered 3 chipped teeth, 2 of which had to be replaced with crowns. She also required stitches for a cut underneath her eye and suffered bruising to her left eye and a bruise in the shape of fingers on her right forearm. Following the sentencing, U.S. Attorney Randy Grossman said, quote, "Attacks on flight crew members who perform vital jobs to ensure passenger safety will not be tolerated." The 29-year-old suspect was found guilty of 1 charge of interfering with flight crew members, and along with a prison sentence must also serve 3 years of supervised release, during which she's required to take an anger management course. She must also pay $25,980 in restitution and a $7,500 fine. Plus, she's judicially banned from flying on commercial aircraft during her 3-year term of suspension. Quinones was meant to be sentenced earlier this year, but she was arrested for driving under the influence in January after the California Highway Patrol spotted her driving erratically. As part of her defense, Quinones claimed that gastric band surgery caused her blood alcohol concentration to rise abnormally. And finally, from AINonline.com, FAA inspector took money and hookers to ignore violations. Last week, a former FAA safety inspector admitted taking bribes in the form of shirts, dinners, money, prostitutes, and an airplane from key executives of Guam-based Hansen Helicopters. During day 19 of the trial of USA versus John D. Walker, owner and CEO, and Hansen Helicopters, witness Timothy Sislow, formerly a $102,000 a year FAA Honolulu FSDO aviation safety inspector, said he took these bribes in exchange for falsifying multiple airworthiness certificates for Hansen's fleet of more than 50 Hughes 369 turbine single-engine helicopters. The company leased them out for $40,000 a month each through a collection of Hansen-controlled third-country offshore entities for use as tuna boat-based spotting aircraft. Sislow said he handled paperwork to help Walker, a licensed FAA A&P mechanic, to qualify for renewal of his FAA aircraft inspector authorization. Federal prosecutors have alleged that Hansen operated a fleet of Frankenstein helicopters, assembled for as little as $82,000 each, and replete with unapproved parts, falsified logbooks, and mismatched data plates belonging to scrapped aircraft retrieved from salvage yards. The U.S. government suggested that these practices were at least in part responsible for 30 accidents that killed 9 people over 2 decades. Walker has pleaded not guilty. Under questioning on Thursday, Sislow admitted taking money and hookers from Hansen between 2009 and 2017. Hansen also shipped Sislow, who lives in Hawaii, a vintage Taylorcraft single-engine airplane, which he assembled and flew. Miller produced a collection of emails, primarily between Sislow and Hansen's Crow, which the prosecution said showed a clear and ongoing criminal conspiracy and a mutually beneficial, informal, and personal relationship. Sislow typically used his personal email address for these communications and admitted to visiting Walker at his home hangar in Missouri. In connection with the case in 2018, Sislow pleaded guilty to 3 felony counts of honest services wire fraud. He has yet to be sentenced but could face penalties of up to 20 years imprisonment and $250,000 in fines on each count. He no longer works at the FAA. During his testimony, Sislow characterized his relationship with Hansen as completely unprofessional and unacceptable. Any regard for safety was thrown out the window in the garbage can. I allowed them, Hansen, to operate. I looked the other way. So that's the news for this week. Coming up next, we'll be talking with DPE Seth Lake about what you need to know about expense sharing and illegal charters. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. We'll get to Seth in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to share one or two updates and also a few of your emails. First, we've got good news. Patron mega supporter Jim Goldfuss has just passed his CFII check ride. He says, I really challenged myself by not only doing it in a Cessna 172, since 99% of my time is in PA-28s, but also with a G1000. Your G1000 book was instrumental in helping me survive. Congratulations, Jim. That's great. And yes, I often used check rides as opportunities to get checked out in a new aircraft because you're going to be spending a lot of hours in the airplane anyway, working on the instrument rating or the commercial or whatever. So might as well check out in a new aircraft at the same time. Also, I wanted to give you an update on my trip to North Carolina, which got canceled. Turned out that because of a variety of different reasons, the gentleman I was going to fly with started heading back west on his own. We talked about different points where I would meet up with him, but ultimately the points he suggested were so close to the West Coast that it didn't even make sense for me to join him. So he successfully made it across the country on his own, which is awesome. Now here's a really interesting email from Stan in Idaho. This is in reference to the crash at Burley, Idaho that we've talked about in the last couple of episodes. He says, thank you for highlighting the danger of steam. I worked next door, and I think he means to the potato factory, for nearly 10 years. I became familiar with the potato process, including the steam peelers. I am also a private pilot based out of Burley for several years. The steam peelers are brilliant devices, and I recall you said that you studied thermodynamics in college, so you may be familiar with steam tables, which are useful in this scenario. The potatoes are not boiled in water. They are gently dropped into a pivoting pressure vessel. Steam at 150 psi or higher is injected into the pressure vessel. And by the way, I went out to look at a steam table, something I haven't looked at since college, and steam at 150 psi would be approximately 366 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 185 degrees Celsius. He continues, injected into the pressure vessel. The potatoes are relatively cold, so the steam vapor condenses and penetrates the peel. After an appropriate period of time to allow penetration, the pressure vessel undergoes a nearly immediate depressurization. The condensate under the potato skin flashes, blowing the skin off the potato. Recovering this heat is problematic due to the solids that you mentioned in your podcast. It plugs heat exchangers rapidly, so the steam is simply released. If there is a bolus of unmixed superheated steam above the plant of any significant size, it would be formidable to an airplane. Superheated steam is a very strange animal. It's a good insulator, it does not transfer heat well, and it has a very low mass compared to the mix of nitrogen, oxygen, and gases that comprise our Earth's atmosphere. Superheated steam at Burley would have an equivalent density altitude way up in the flight levels, plus no available oxygen to support combustion, or lift for that matter. If you study steam tables and understand that steam has no available oxygen for combustion, you easily realize that this is incompatible with flight. Yet what is unknown is, could these conditions actually happen? Could potato peelers release enough steam to significantly change the atmosphere experienced by an aircraft which is moving rapidly? I don't know. The visibility problem steam causes is obvious and has been experienced by many. The steam problem, hard to know. Hopefully the NTSB will consult with some good process engineers, industrial hygienists, and perhaps do some localized atmospheric studies to find out if a processing plant can actually do more than create visibility problems and turbulence. These problems that I've described with steam are a risk that undoubtedly has been studied for workers. If you have an area with a high amount of steam, it presents not just a burn risk, but a suffocation risk as well, as it displaces oxygen. So I'm sure it's been studied in the industry. And he notes that the name of the county, which I mispronounced, is pronounced either Cassia or Sasha. So Stan, thanks so much for sharing that information. That really does provide a lot of insight. Here's an email from Patreon supporter Bill Ayer. He says, thanks for the excellent podcast on advisory vertical guidance. I also appreciate your continued and detailed analysis of the Burley Caravan event, which shows how proficient pilots can have accidents. It could happen to any of us. Hopefully the NTSB will consider all the factors and not simply chalk it up to descent below minimums in IMC. Just FYI, I have a Garmin GTN 750XI, and I'm now seeing VOR approaches with advisor vertical guidance, just like an RNAV GPS approach. I've flown them here in the Northwest at KOLM and KHQM. Apparently there are also NDB plus V approaches, but it might be hard to find one. The less dive and drive, the better. And he attached a page from the GTN Pilot's Guide. And in the example here, it shows when you hit the proc key and go to select approaches, the choices at KART include, among others, a VOR runway 7 LNAV plus V. So that's really fascinating. I had not heard of this. I went to a simulator this evening to see if I could duplicate it. It's a G1000 simulator, and it did not show the VOR plus V. So apparently that function either hasn't come to the G1000 yet, or the simulator had an older version of the software, though it does have a pretty current database on it. So I'll ask anyone who's listening, check your equipment and tell us which types of Garmin equipment or other equipment you find VOR LNAV plus V approaches now listed, and we'll pass this along to everybody else. Thanks so much for sharing that, Bill. That's really interesting news. And here's a YouTube comment on episode 233, which was last week, about advisory glide slopes. Big Boy Games says, perfect subject. My instrument check ride is tomorrow. Good luck with that. Also a comment from JMH1812. He says, great podcast, Max. However, you make it sound like RNAV approaches are precision approaches, which they are not. And he continues on a little bit. And I wrote back to him that I did say essentially. I didn't say that they were. And I did that because from a pilot's point of view, they are very similar to precision approaches, even if they don't meet the international legal definition for precision approach. I wanted to stay focused on advisory glide slopes and not digress into that topic, which is why I said they are essentially the same as precision approaches and left it at that. Here's an email from patron supporter Mahesh Sankaran. He says, hi, Max. I wanted to let you know that I've updated my credit card information on Patreon. Thank you so very much. It's the end of the month, by the way, and we typically have about a half a dozen patron supporters who drop out of the system because they never get around to updating their credit cards. So, Mahesh, thanks so much for doing that. He says, your analysis of accidents and the lessons one can take away from them has always been excellent and thought-provoking, but I must say that you've taken it to the next level with your analysis of the Cessna 208 crash. I hope that the NTSB listens to your 2 episodes in which you discuss the crash as they work on establishing probable cause. Your discussion on advisory glide slopes was very timely because I flew an advisory glide slope a few days ago that left me scratching my head and thanking my stars that I hadn't flown it for real in IMC. I don't have ready access to a simulator, so I'm hoping that you'll find it interesting and fly it in your simulator and report on the results. I did, by the way. The approach in question is the RNAV approach to runway 7 at November 23, which is the Sydney Municipal Airport in upstate New York. He says, I normally load an approach for guidance even in VMC if the runway doesn't have a VASI or PAPI. The runway has hills at both ends of the runway. I flew the advisory glide slope, but it got so close to the top of the hill that I decided not to chance it and went above the glide slope until I had passed the hill. I have never seen a glide slope that comes so close to an obstruction. Well, thanks so much for that, Mahesh. I'm glad you liked the Caravan episodes. Interestingly, the NTSB chief investigator for the Atlas 767 crash contacted me after we did that episode to let me know how much he liked my episode on the crash, so I know that some NTSB employees do listen to the show. Now, I did try out this approach when I was at the airport this evening on the Flight School Simulator, which is a Precision Flight Controls G1000 simulator, and I've shot video, which I will post for Patreon supporters. But what I can tell you in general is that, first of all, as we've discussed, advisory glide slopes are really only to be used down to the MDA. If you use it below the MDA, you do it at your own risk. I flew the approach using the autopilot coupled to the glide path below the MDA all the way down to the surface of the runway. And interestingly, on short final, the simulator did bounce off the top of that hill. So good thing you didn't stay on that glide slope, because I'm guessing your airplane would not have bounced as well as the simulator did when it hit the terrain there. And here's a very timely email that came in from Patreon supporter Scott Albuquerque. He says, I've been a private pilot since 2000. I passed my check ride this past August and have been flying regularly since. My instructor, Seth Valentine, has been fantastic, and your podcast seems to always parallel his lessons, particularly the Circle to Land one. He was a stickler on those. I honestly feel like I became a real pilot and realized how dangerous I was as a private pilot. That whole thing of you don't know what you don't know really set in for me. And although I am still a very, very raw IFR pilot, 250 hours-ish. I feel so much more equipped to learn, if that makes sense. And your podcast is a huge, in capital letters, asset in that continual learning. And then he goes on to say, one of my employees was headed to visit her brother in Chicago this weekend. I had nothing going on. One of our planes was available. I think those are club airplanes. And I offered to take her. I was going to leave in the morning, drop her off, and come back, returning to get her on Monday. It's only a little more than an hour flight. As I was reserving the time with the owner-manager of the group, he inquired about the trip. I explained what I had planned and said, but no big deal. I'm not charging her anything, just helping her out and giving me a reason to fly. Not thinking I was doing anything wrong, but he clued me into something called common purpose, basically saying I can't operate as a taxi or charter service, meaning if I was already headed there, she could come along, but since we don't have a common purpose, it is not legal regardless of any money exchange. It's so simple, yet I don't know how I didn't realize it. I was so hung up on I'm not taking any money, so I'm good, that I didn't even think about that common purpose aspect. I would guess a lot of owners do this anyway. Curious on your take on this. Well, Scott, coincidentally, I had already scheduled the interview with Seth Lake when your message came in, so we talked exactly about your situation, and I would say that your club manager doesn't have it quite right. Needing a common purpose only applies to cost sharing, and since you weren't going to look for any reimbursement, it doesn't apply. You didn't have to have a common purpose. So I think your club manager may have gotten things slightly twisted there, but take a listen to our interview with Seth because we talk exactly about your situation. And as I mentioned earlier, it's that time of month. It's the end of the month, and so we always have about 4 or 5 patron supporters with expired credit cards. Most of those, even though I prod them a little bit, never get around to updating it. So we always lose 4 or 5 supporters each month. So this is perfect time. If you've been thinking about becoming a member and supporting the show, please head on out right now to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, since you're an awesome listener, and choose what level you'd like to support us at. Also, you can make a one-time donation or even a monthly donation at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And now listen and see if you know any of these people who've just joined us in the last week. On Patreon, we have new supporters at the $20 a month level, so they'll be seeing the videos, for example, of the advisory glide slope test that I just ran this evening. These include Peter Gonzalez, Andrew Carnani, and Jim Gosney. We also have Nick N., who joined us, and George Strawnmeyer edited his pledge up to $8 a month. We also have a new monthly PayPal donor, which is Inderpal Shabra at $10 a month. Thank you so much. And a one-time donation from William Terrell of $50, who says, thanks for your insight. Yeah, and I want to thank everyone who makes a contribution regardless of how you support the show. And now let me tell you a little bit about Seth Lake. Seth is an Air Force Reserve C-130 instructor pilot recently out of active duty. He's now a full-time flight instructor in DPE, giving check rides in Arkansas. His business, VSL Aviation, operates 6 beach travel airs. He specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in those aircraft. And now here's our conversation with Seth Lake. Well, Seth, welcome back to the show. Great to have you here again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Max. Good to be here.
Well, you had suggested a few weeks ago that we talk about expense sharing and illegal charters. Now, that's something that could impact just about any pilot. But tell me, how did you get interested in this topic?
Yeah, as a pilot examiner given check rides in the airman certification standards for both the private pilot and commercial pilot, they kind of go in order of the areas of operation that the tasks are in a logical order. So the first thing you talk about is your qualifications. So under pilot qualifications, you have to know what your limitations are as both a private pilot and a commercial pilot. So it's one of the first things that we discuss during a check ride scenario. And I tend to notice things that have kind of common weak areas. And I would say that this is a weak area where there's at least some confusion on what those limitations are in regards to cost sharing for a private pilot. And then as a commercial pilot, cost sharing still applies there, but then also understanding how to spot and be careful of illegal charter situations. So it's just a weak area that I've seen. And then going into the actual FARs, it is kind of a gray area there where we use terms like holding out, which is kind of confusing. We don't use that in day-to-day discussions. And it's really just a legal term that's really hard to put your finger on. And looking at it, the other media that's on like FAAsafety.gov, there's a few webinars that cover illegal cost sharing, but even those can leave some questions there where, there's some obvious gray areas that I think we could just do a better job of communicating.
I totally agree. This is a confusing area. When I took my commercial check ride some 30 years ago, I know I got this question wrong, but fortunately I went on to pass my commercial. Well, let's kind of start with the most basic things that might affect, for example, a private pilot, and therefore could affect almost everybody listening. This scenario actually came to me from a listener just in the past week who didn't even know we were going to be talking about this. And he said that one of his employees needed to get to Chicago, and so he offered to take this employee there for free. So I guess his question is, can a private pilot just be benevolent and take someone somewhere for free, even if the pilot wasn't planning to go there?
Yeah, and in that case, there's no money exchanging hands, so you're not being compensated at all. You're not even cost sharing in that example. So for that example, yeah, you could travel and take someone there as long as they're not paying anything, even the pro rata share. So if we change one thing about that and we just say, well, their passenger is now going to pay the pro rata share, which again is just basically the cost of fuel, oil, airport fees, and rental fees for the aircraft. If the passenger pays that, then that actually becomes kind of a misuse of cost sharing because the pilot didn't have a common purpose to go there. So there's this common purpose test that we need to ask ourselves of, is there a reason that I need to go to Chicago as well? Or am I just going there because my passenger wants to go there? But again, if my passenger wants to go there and I take them and I don't accept any money, then that's fine. It's just if they're going to pay their pro rata share, that's when it becomes the question. So if you're going to get any payment, it doesn't even have to meet the threshold of being, full compensation for the flight. Of course, as a private pilot, you can't accept more than your pro rata share, or that would be, actual compensation. Then you're looking at an illegal charter. It bleeds over from just abusing cost sharing to becoming an illegal charter. So short answer, yes, the pilot could fly. Out of the goodness of their heart, just donate their entire flight. That's fine. If they're going to receive any compensation or the pro rata share, then there needs to be a common purpose to go to Chicago.
Good. Let's talk more about common purpose. Tell us more about that. What, for example, would be a common purpose and what would not be a common purpose?
Yeah. So let's say that same example. Let's say your pilot friend was already planning to go to Chicago because they just needed to build some flight time and there's a good restaurant. So they had already planned this. And somehow their friend found out that they were going to Chicago and they're like, well, I need to go to Chicago as well. I just, I purchased something off of, Facebook Marketplace and I need to pick it up and bring it back. Can I ride along and share the expense of that flight? So in that case, that would be a legal use or that would be a appropriate use. Legal and illegal sound too similar, so I'll try to stick to appropriate, but that would be an appropriate use of cost sharing because even though the common purpose isn't the same, they have the common purpose to go to Chicago. The destination is the same. So the actual purpose doesn't have to be identical, but the destination, the need to go to that destination needs to exist between both parties. Now, we could change it up further and say, let's say 6 people wanted to go to Chicago for some sort of conference, and your pilot only had a 4-passenger airplane, and they thought, well, we can do this still, but I'm going to have to make 2 trips. So in that case, cost sharing would be it would be appropriate for the first flight, but for the second flight to bring the additional passengers, that wouldn't be appropriate because the common purpose doesn't exist to make 2 trips. The common purpose was just for the 1 trip. So he could take 3 people along in a 4-seater airplane, regarding or making sure that weight and balance and all the performance and stuff is correct, obviously. But that second trip, even though the common purpose seems to exist, it's not actually there because you never intended to make 2 trips. It was just 1 trip. So hopefully that's not too confusing, but that's how you could operate in some sort of gray area, doing multiple trips to a location to get a bunch of passengers there. That wouldn't be appropriate. But as long as there's a common purpose to go there, for that 1 trip, then yeah, you could do that and split the cost, and that would all be an appropriate use of that rule.
And I have seen on the NBAA website where they talk about guidance on sharing cost. They said this regarding common purpose, quote, "Put simply, the common purpose test can be stated as, but for the receipt of compensation, the pilot would not have taken that flight." So I guess that probably helps explain it. For example, if we were to think about an employer-employee relationship, let's say I was still working at HP and my former boss came to me and said, "Hey, Max, I need to go to this meeting in Fresno and you're a pilot. Could you take me down there?" What would you say?
Well, I would have to ask, what is your what's the relationship between you and your boss and the aircraft? So in that scenario, throw out some examples of how that would happen there.
Oh, sure. Let's take something that's far afield from aviation. Let's say I still work for HP as I did years ago, and my boss needed to get to that meeting in Fresno. I wasn't planning to go to that meeting, but hey, I want to help out my boss.
Okay. Are you a commercially rated airplane or pilot?
I am. It's not my airplane, and it's not my boss's airplane.
Okay. So that's a really good question. So if your boss and your company didn't own the airplane and they're just asking you to do this, you would be exercising your private pilot privileges, and that would not be an appropriate use of cost sharing in that case. So there would be a way you could potentially do it legitimately, but with the information you gave me there, then I'd have to say no, that's not an appropriate use of cost sharing at all. There might be a way to do that under a private carriage setup, but not a private pilot cost sharing setup.
I would agree. There was no common purpose. I was not planning to go to that meeting, and it was just my boss that was going down there. So, no, I can't see a way that we would be able to do any cost sharing. Now, if I were to change it up a little bit, and I planned to go to that meeting all along, and my boss said, "Hey, I heard you're going to be flying down. Can I tag along because I'm going to that meeting as well?" Well, then probably I could ask for my boss to pay for his share of the trip.
Right. And that kind of, let's go ahead and talk about this because I think it's a natural question that would come up of, Max, let's just say Hewlett Packard asked you to go to this meeting and you're being paid by Hewlett Packard and you decide to fly there. So that could be seen as, well, Max, you're being compensated to fly to this meeting. But that's kind of incidental to your business there. So that's allowed to do under a private pilot. You're not being paid to fly. You're being paid to go to that meeting, and you're just using an aircraft as a means of transportation there. In other words, you can be compensated by your company, even compensated for the use of that aircraft there, and that's not a commercial operation. And it's also not public carriage. You're not holding out for anyone. You're not taking anybody from point A to point B. But, I guess if you look at it in the right light, it could be seen as, well, you're being compensated to fly, so isn't that breaking the rules? But it's incidental to your business, so that wouldn't be an abuse of your private pilot privileges.
Yes, and just to be clear, I wasn't employed by them as a pilot. I worked there as an engineer in sales and marketing, and so things might be a little different if I were employed by them as a pilot, so I just want to clarify that a little bit.
Right.
So let's just talk a little bit about cost sharing in more detail. Suppose I'm a private pilot, I'm going with friends, we have a common purpose, we all had to go to the same place around the same time. For which expenses can I reasonably ask for them to pay their pro rata share?
Yeah, so that's covered in the FARs. There's also a really good advisory circular, 61-142. So you can type 61 AC 61-142 into Google, and you'll one of the first results will be the PDF document that is this advisory circular. It was issued in 2020. It actually reads really well. Kind of on a separate note, the FAA has been releasing a lot of new advisory circulars, and I think they'll continue to do that because rulemaking has become kind of onerous on the FAA, and it's difficult to do. So it's a lot easier for them to just publish an AC to clarify things rather than trying to make the FARs more clear, which is a very difficult thing to do. But anyway, 61-142 does a good job of talking about cost sharing. So I'll just read straight from that. For the sharing expenses, the pro rata operating flight would be, or the operating costs, it's only going to include fuel, oil, airport expenditures, or rental fees. So those would be the things that would be appropriate to cost share. If you were an owner of an aircraft and you were trying to find some scheme where they were going to pay an engine reserve or maintenance reserve, or amortize the cost of the airplane for that time, that wouldn't be appropriate. That's kind of a slippery slope. It needs to just be limited to fuel, oil, rental, and airport fees. So let's say you were renting the airplane and it was $1,000 a wet rate that you're paying at the flight school, which includes fuel and oil. And typically flight schools do that in their rental rate, right? So you could split that $1,000 fee, and then if the landing fee costs $50, you could split that pro rata for the landing fee. That would all be appropriate things that you could share expenses on. But if you're an aircraft owner, it wouldn't be appropriate for you to work in the maintenance fees or the actual cost of ownership of that airplane into a cost sharing scheme.
I think that's a good description. If we had two people in the airplane and it's a rental situation, then as the pilot, I really am getting fully compensated for half of my total cost. But if I own the airplane, I'm getting compensated for less than half my total cost because I'm just getting back half of the cost of the fuel and the other expenses you mentioned, and not all of the many other fees I incur, like the insurance I pay each month, the monthly tie-down fee, the cost of maintenance, the engine reserve. So really, as an owner, I'm getting back a pretty small fraction of my actual cost per hour.
Right. And that's let's go ahead and talk about that. That's one of the reasons why I think people have an issue with this is there is that incentive of, hey, I can share the expense of this airplane. I can offset the cost. I hear that a lot from airplane owners or potential aircraft owners is there any way I can offset the cost of this airplane? And when you're faced with a $1,000 fee to fly somewhere or rental expense, and you see a way that you can offset some of that cost, the temptation is there. There's the incentive there to try to get as much money or share as much expense as possible. But especially as an aircraft owner, that's a slippery slope. And I would err on the side of make sure you can fully explain that you're paying more than your fair share rather than less than your fair share. Because always paying more than your fair share, you're going to be in a better situation than if you're paying less. Because if you're paying less, then that's going to be seen as compensation. And that's when you've broken the rules there.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any special rules that apply to safety pilots? Do they have to end up paying to fly along?
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up because that's probably it's one thing that I've heard a lot of people discuss is you want to split the rental costs. So let's say, Max, you and I wanted to go fly and you wanted to get some time in this new Diamond Twin, and it's really expensive. And I'm like, well, Max, I don't know if I want to safety pilot for you because that's going to be quite expensive for me to go safety pilot in this airplane. I'm on more of a Cessna 150 budget, not a DA-62 budget. But fortunately, I could safety pilot for you without paying anything because in that case, first of all, I'm acting as a required crew member because the FAA says that if you're going to log simulated instrument time, there must be a safety pilot on board, making me a required crew member. So I'm not a passenger in that case. So cost sharing really isn't a thing then. But if we wanted to split the cost, we're more than welcome to do that. Or you could pay the full amount, or I could pay the full amount. But at that point, we're acting as two crew members flying an airplane. And yes, we're allowed to expense share on that, or you can pay all, or I can pay all. Now, I am getting to put PIC time in my logbook without having to pay anything in that first example where you're going to pay for the full rental rate. But that's not me abusing cost sharing because, again, I was acting as a required crew member on that flight.
Let's talk a little bit more about non-monetary compensation and also the Kerwin letter of interpretation. I'm sure some people might say, hey, I'm not getting paid, so I'm not getting compensated. And yet the FAA might not agree.
Yeah, it's important to point out that nothing needs to exchange hands necessarily for there to be compensation. There's a legal interpretation. The Kerwin opinion, I think, is a legal interpretation. I guess it's not an opinion, but the legal and it's important to point out that that legal interpretations are isolated to that one question. And the FAA will tell you that doesn't broadly apply to everyone, but we kind of treat that as precedent, that if we were to ask about our individual scenario, the FAA would probably point back to that legal interpretation. Not to get too lawyeristic there, but I'm just stating the facts. But this legal interpretation basically says that compensation isn't isolated to just money. It could be the expectation or expectation of services or a profit motive. So one of the examples I would say is let's say you own an airplane, or you're a pilot and you rent an airplane as a business owner, and you fly one of your potential subcontractors, you fly them to a meeting and you don't charge them anything at all, and you pay for all the expenses. That could easily be seen as a profit motive because you're expecting some sort of service in return for that. And that would be a very low bar for the FAA to clear in the court of law to say, well, you had a profit motive clearly because there was a conflict of interest there. So even though you weren't being compensated monetarily, you were still being compensated because of the nature of your relationship with that passenger.
Well, and the FAA really broadly defines compensation. It doesn't just have to be money. What about people who are looking to build time to become airline pilots, for example? What kind of compensation might the FAA infer that they're getting by doing something for free?
Right. So the FAA has ruled that just the accrual of flight hours can be seen as compensation. And so that can actually be found again in 61-142. There's a compensation paragraph in there where it talks about, compensation. It doesn't require profit or profit motive even. It could just be the goodwill, or it could be the accrual of flight hours, are all seen as forms of compensation. So when we say compensation, it doesn't just mean that money has to exchange hands or even a profit motive has to be there. It could just be the accrual of flight hours. There's a couple of legal interpretations that you can find in there. I don't have them off the top of my head, but you can just put in search compensation in the legal interpretation section of the FAA website, and you'll have several legal interpretations come up. One of them discusses an organization's that it's petitioning to, it wants to take patients from point A to point B, and it wants to do that with donations. And it's very specific, saying our pilots aren't going to be compensated. They're volunteer pilots. And these donations are coming to cover the cost of the airfare for these patients. So the only money that's moving around is to cover the expense of that trip, and the pilots are volunteering their time. And the FAA ruled that those pilots logging that flight hour, that is a form of compensation. So they would need to have a Part 119 certificate or a 135 certificate in order to do that legitimately. So even though the pilots weren't getting money, they were getting flight hours that could later count towards the achievement of a rating. So that's a form of compensation. So that's an example of how you could kind of be lured into doing this inadvertently by saying, well, I'm not getting any money. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a legitimate form of compensation.
Okay, let's talk about commercial pilots and what they can do. Now, let's suppose I just passed my commercial check ride today. What can I legally get paid to do tomorrow as a commercial pilot?
All right. So one of the things that I'll bring up in any commercial check ride are, what are your limitations? And your limitations are basically you can potentially fly for compensation, but it needs to be under a Part 119 certificate holder, or it needs to be one of the things listed in Part 119, paragraph E. So that if you look at FAR 119.1, and then paragraph E, it gives a list of exemptions that you can do as a commercial pilot outside of the structure of the Part 135 and 121 world. So that includes flight instruction, aircraft ferrying, pipeline survey, banner towing. Those are just some of the few things that you can do that are listed as exemptions. So you could, in theory, you could start that the day after your commercial check ride, and that would be completely appropriate. What wouldn't be appropriate is for you to fly people or cargo for compensation, and more importantly, you can't fly the general public on that. So that's where the the question of operational control comes up rather quickly as a commercial pilot, is you really need to understand operational control as a commercial pilot.
Well, that's a good lead into that. Tell us about operational control and what do we need to know about it?
Right. So the reason I like talking about operational control for commercial pilots is when I talk about limitations in the commercial check ride, one of the first things that comes up, I would say nearly 100% of the time, is someone tells me, well, I can't hold out. And we've all heard that term, holding out, and it's kind of a frustrating term because it's such an odd term, and I guess broadly it means advertising. What it really means is just that you have the willingness to take someone, just anyone, someone off the street from point A to point B. That's what holding out means. It doesn't mean that you have to advertise. In fact, a lot of times holding out is just that you have the reputation to be willing to fly people from point A to point B. So I'll ask, well, can you have a business card? If a commercial pilot, and I have put Seth Lake as a commercial pilot, and I put that business card out in the FBO, during the check ride scenario, they quickly think it's a trap. So they're like, no, I can't have a business card. And so if we're near the FBO, usually I'll go out to the FBO, I'll find a pilot's card, and I'll bring it in and I'll be like, so you're telling me that Joe here is just blatantly violating the law by having his business card out in the lobby, and they get a little nervous, and so quickly it turns into, okay, holding out is more than just advertising. It's not just limited to that. And me saying that I'm a commercial pilot to the general public, that's not holding out either. But what I really need to answer as a pilot is who has operational control of the airplane. So operational control, it happens on a scale. So someone with full operational control would be, let's say, an aircraft owner. So if I own an aircraft and I'm also the pilot of that, I have full operational control. So I'm at the highest end of the scale there. And at the other end of the scale is someone on a Southwest Airlines flight that's just a passenger. They have no operational control over that airplane. They just bought a ticket and they're there. They're just the general public. There's a very low barrier of entry to do that. And you have zero operational control. And in between there's a full scale. So if I go out and rent an airplane, well, are you in operational control? You have some aspects of operational control. Some of the questions that we ask, and this is in a truth in leasing document. So this is in 9137B. It's an advisory circular, and it talks about operational control. So here are the 6 questions that it lists. Who makes the decision to assign crew members to the aircraft, accept flight requests, initiate and conduct and terminate flights? So basically, who's deciding when to go on the flight and who's doing that flight? For whom does the pilot work as a direct employee or agents? Who's maintaining the aircraft and where it's maintained? Prior to departure, who ensures the flight, the aircraft, the crew comply with the regulations? Who decides when and where maintenance is accomplished and pays for that maintenance? Who determines weather fuel requirements and who directly pays for the fuel? And who directly pays for airport fees, parking, hangar costs, food service, rental cars, other things. So there's 6 questions basically there. And all those questions revolve around who's making decisions on this flight. So when our Southwest Airlines example, well, Southwest Airlines decides, who insures the airplane and how it's crewed, and the pilots all work for Southwest, and they operate basically every question they can answer, yes, we do that. As a rental pilot, you can answer yes to some of those, but you can't decide where the aircraft is maintained, right? Whoever owns that airplane is maintaining that element of operational control. So this is where we get into the discussion of a dry lease, of you have a passenger on board that is saying that they're leasing the aircraft. So I would want to ask some of these questions to that passenger as a commercial pilot to decide if this is a legitimate private carriage, because that's really what we're trying to get to here, is decide, is this flight under public carriage or is it private carriage? So asking all these questions about operational control, it's important for a commercial pilot because a commercial pilot has to be able to decide, first of all, am I the commercial pilot that's acting as pilot in command of this flight? Am I in operational control of this airplane? If the answer is yes to that, there is a really high likelihood that you're operating an illegal charter. The other question is my passenger exercising operational control over this flight? If your passenger is exercising operational control, there's a very good chance that you're participating in private carriage, and that's a legitimate thing that you can do as a commercial pilot. The tricky thing with holding out, and where holding out plays into operational control, is you don't have to be a pilot to hold out. So this can be a really risky thing for a commercial pilot. So real quick, as an example, let's say that you are a full-time pilot for a business and they hired you as their pilot, and you're constantly flying there. Let's say it's a King Air, and you're flying this King Air from point A to point B, and somebody at the business calls you and sets up these flights, and you show up at the airport and you fly them to a meeting and fly them back home. That's a legitimate way. There's thousands of pilots that do that as a career all over the country, and that's again a completely legitimate thing for you to do. Now let's say you show up at the airport and there's some passengers that you've never recognized before, and they're wearing beach clothes and they've got some bags, and it quickly becomes apparent that you're taking them on a vacation. This isn't a business trip, and you're normally flying for a business. So this is where I would start asking some questions as a pilot, saying, well, first of all, where's the people I normally take? How are you related to this business? Because if I fly you to the beach, and let's say now my business owner actually offered his airplane and his pilot to fly one of his business partners on a family vacation. So he's actually holding out, and you're kind of passively participating in that holding out operation. And you may not be aware of that directly unless you ask the appropriate questions, because now he's holding out because he's advertising flights to the general public and offering up your services. And the person that you're flying in the back isn't directly related to, and they are not directly employed by the entity that maintains operational control of that aircraft. So that, and hopefully that's a rather big nutshell, but in a nutshell, that's why operational control is so important. And you really need to understand how it works as a commercial pilot, because if you don't know how operational control works, you could easily inadvertently get involved in illegal charter.
I think that last example is fascinating because a pilot might not even know that their boss or whomever is taking money or setting things up in a way that the pilots can get into trouble. Now, going back to operational control, you said that if the pilot has operational control, then it's most likely an illegal charter. Now, I guess the exception would be is if they happen to have gotten a Part 135 certificate for themselves and they've also passed a Part 135 check ride, in addition to getting their commercial pilot's license, then they probably are legal when they have operational control and are taking people for hire.
Right, absolutely. So in that specific example, I am a check airman for a Part 135. So as a Part 135 pilot, even then, a normal Part 135 rarely is the pilot in command exercising operational control, because there's only 3 people in a Part 135 that can exercise operational control. That can be the same as the pilot in command, but unless you're operating in a single pilot Part 135, which there are a lot of those out there, in a larger Part 135, it's very rare that one of the people that can exercise operational control is actually at the controls of the plane. Usually that's like the chief pilot, director of operations, or director of maintenance. Those 3 people are rarely the ones that are acting as PIC. So even in a Part 135 operation, you're rarely exercising operational control. You're exercising pilot in command authority. Now, a pilot in command can exercise some elements of operational control, especially when we think about making the decision to divert, because in that instance, you are deciding where the plane's going to land, and you alone. And so you're exercising that authority that comes with being a pilot in command. However, a Southwest pilot sitting at the gate can't just suddenly decide, hey, instead of going to Denver, I think we're going to go to Atlanta. That wouldn't be an appropriate thing that they could do. Only somebody in operational control could do that.
Let's talk about issues for flight instructors. Flight instructors come across all kinds of offers to do things that may or may not be legal from a charter standpoint. Can I get at least, I'd say, a couple of these calls every year? Usually it's a pilot I don't know well or don't know at all who calls up and says, hey, I'd like to get some flight instruction in the Club Airplane Max, and at the end of the flight, I want you to drop me off at a different airport from where we started. Does that sound like an illegal charter to you?
Yeah, that does, unfortunately. So that would fall in line with sham instruction. So there's a couple of these that are basically abuse of flight instruction or sham instruction. I forget the exact verbiage that the FAA uses, but yeah, it's basically you're using the premise of flight instruction as a cover for an illegal charter. And I've run into this as an instructor as well. You'll have somebody that knows a little bit about aviation. Maybe they're a private pilot. Maybe they're not even a private pilot. They've just looked into it and they've read somewhere, well, hey, all I need to do, I'm not asking for a charter. I want cross country flight instruction from point A to point B. If they're renting an airplane to do that, then that is probably an illegal or a misuse of flight instruction. Now, where that might be legal is if an aircraft owner calls you and they own an aircraft, and let's say they're working on their instrument rating, and they want to hire you as a CFI to fly with them to a busy Class B airport that they've never been to before. In that case, that's legitimate instruction. And again, they're maintaining operational control of that aircraft. So there comes up that question of operational control. They're maintaining it. You're not deciding to do that, and they're incurring all that expense and paying you to do that as an instructor. And furthermore, you're being paid as an instructor in that case, and that falls in within that Part 119, 1, paragraph E exemptions. But there is a way to abuse that if they're renting the aircraft and they're just using that as transportation. So it may seem like a fine line, but it's definitely there where it can be abused.
I agree. I think flight instructors really have to watch out for this. It might be a little different if it's a regular person that you fly with all the time. There might be more of a case for that. But if someone calls up out of the blue, one-time flight, even if they're a private pilot, that really smells like a charter to me, and I certainly avoid those things. In fact, this situation is so common that, of course, we know that Part 135 is the normal section for charter, but there's a special name for this which people call Part 134 and a half, which is this kind of fake charter. So this kind of illegal activity is so common, it has its own name.
Yeah, Max. Everybody, I think, that has been in the industry very long has heard of that term, Part 134 and a half. And unfortunately, the FAA is fully cognizant that this is happening. They understand that illegal charter is happening, and they're really short-staffed. It's really hard for them to enforce. But I'll ask you this: what government agency do you think is most interested in Part 134 and a half?
Oh gosh, I don't know. The IRS?
Yes, the IRS. So I'm going to lay out this example for you, and it makes sense of why we care as commercial pilots. First of all, this is very easily, it could be unsafe because people that are operating as illegal charter, either inadvertently or on purpose, they're skirting the rules. They're not holding themselves to the same training standards of Part 135. Their aircraft aren't held to the same standards. And they may even say, well, I'm just as safe as the guy down the road. In fact, my aircraft's even newer than that legitimate 135 operator, and my pilots are more experienced. So they may try to say that they're safer, but really operating outside the rules is never safer. And so it is unsafe. Furthermore, the taxes that are required for an air carrier service are rather high. I think it's around 9%. A fee is charged on charter operators. And that's, of course, priced into their product, along with the extra maintenance, the extra overhead it takes to run a 135, the training requirements for their pilots, which are higher than Part 91. And so they have a lot higher operating expenses. So somebody that's out there shopping for a cheap way to get from point A to point B, they may find an illegitimate charter operation that has a much cheaper price. And so they're going to go with that. And the general public is ignorant of the safety concerns that brings up. So they go with that. And let's say over the years, there's pilots that are flying for this outfit and they feel like it's a legitimate outfit and they're getting paid well. They might be just coming out of their first instructor job. So they're getting paid really well. So maybe they're not asking the right questions because they're making good money, right? Well, the FAA knows that this is happening, but again, the FAA is short-staffed, so they might not actually catch them. But let's say the legitimate charter operator down the street, they know that this is occurring. They might just let the IRS know, hey, we think that there's an illegal charter operation going on, and they're doing a lot of business. So there could be a lot of revenue there for the IRS that you're not getting. Well, the IRS is very likely to dispatch somebody to do a little bit of investigation. And once they are pretty sure they have a good case, they'll be able to levy, back taxes, fines, and they'll probably be nice enough to give those investigation results to the FAA and say, hey, by the way, here's all the pilot certificates involved in this operation. And now all the pilots have suspended or revoked certificates because they were operating with an illegal charter operation. So even though the FAA isn't big enough to catch all of this, the IRS, it has some pretty large sums of money to incentivize its participation in cracking down on this. And other Part 135 operators have the ability. In fact, there's a place they can go on the FAA to report illegal charter. So you will have several different branches of the federal government come and try to shut down this operation. So as a pilot, it's very important that you're asking the right questions and making sure that you're not working for, an unscrupulous person that may be trying to bend the rules. Because I'll just remind you again, you don't have to be a pilot to hold out. So you may think that you're doing your due diligence, and just because you're not asking the right questions, that could put you at risk.
Well, and from time to time, we do read about illegal charters, mostly because of accidents that occur. For example, I was talking with Rob Mark a few days ago, and he brought up a Falcon accident in Greenville, South Carolina back in 2018. Both pilots were killed. The two passengers on board survived, and it turned out that neither pilot was qualified in that particular aircraft. And the problem is so big that if you go to the National Air Transportation Association's website, illegal charters is a big bright red button right at the top that's more prominent than any of the other buttons. And they also have a separate website called avoidillegalcharter.com, and it's got ways you can look up a charter operator to see if they're a legitimate Part 135. And there's even an illegal charter reporting form. So if you suspect someone at your airport is doing Part 134.5 charter work, it probably would make sense for you to go ahead and file a report.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people that are getting involved in this. And like I said, not all of it is on purpose. I think I mentioned dry lease, but dry lease is one that I've heard come up a lot recently, where you might have an individual that doesn't own an airplane, and maybe they don't use an airplane very often, but they've got a big family trip and they want to lease an aircraft to go from point A to point B. So let's say they want to lease an aircraft and go down to Cozumel, and they're going to take a big family trip, and they're throwing all the money at it, and they're a wealthy individual, can afford it. So they come to a person and say, hey, we'd like to lease your aircraft, and we'll pay $20,000 for the week for use of this citation. Now, there is a way that could be legitimate. There's a legitimate way, and it happens all the time, to lease aircraft. But there's also many ways that could be illegitimate. And the question goes back to, well, who's in operational control? If this person leasing the aircraft is never owned an airplane, and they don't know how to safely crew an airplane, and they don't know how maintenance works, then really that's a sham lease, right? We're just calling it a lease to make it look legal. There may even be some legal paperwork that we keep on the plane. Operators have gone so far to put laminated cards, and they hand the passengers and they say, hey, if the FAA comes on board, make sure you read from this list that you are the lessee and you have operational control of the airplane. And the FAA said, that's a great piece of evidence to prove that it's an illegitimate or a sham lease if you're having to coach the passengers on how to exercise operational control. Ways that could be legitimate is, let's say a large business who owns maybe 2 or 3 aircraft. They lease another aircraft because the one that they wanted to use is down for long-term maintenance, and they lease it from another company. That is probably a legitimate lease operation, and that company knows full well how to exercise operational control, and it's completely legal. So I'm not saying that all dry lease operations are illegal, but that's definitely something, especially when a younger commercial pilot comes to me and says, hey, my owner is thinking of leasing his plane out to these other people to offset some cost. We have a long discussion about how that could be a slippery slope and how that could get that young pilot in some trouble with the FAA.
Yes, and there are a couple of things I want to throw out on dry leases. If you enter an agreement with an aircraft owner to dry lease their aircraft, then you as the lessee are responsible for hiring the pilot. Now, if the people leasing the aircraft to you are supplying the pilot, then most likely it's not a legal dry lease. And also the FAA has held that aircraft owners that enter into dry lease agreements for their aircraft shouldn't have too many of these agreements, or it's going to start to look like illegal charter. For example, in one case I read that the FAA found that a company that had 3 dry lease agreements was fine and legitimate, but that another company that had somewhere between 18 and 24 dry leases was not legitimate because it started to look more like a charter operation and less like a dry lease operation.
Right. Yeah, that's a common advisory circular that comes up in the commercial check ride, and that also causes some confusion on the dry lease. As you said, the dry versus wet is referring to crew or no crew. It's not referring to fuel, which is confusing because typically people renting an airplane, when they talk about a wet rental rate, they're talking about with fuel versus a dry rental rate, which is without fuel. When you're talking about aircraft leases, you're talking about at least one crew member is provided, then that's a wet lease. If no crew members are provided, that's a dry lease. But then again, the question is really who has operational control that can find qualified crew. So if you think person off the street that doesn't know anything about aviation, it would be very difficult for them to be able to supply the crew if they don't even know what kind of crew is needed for that airplane or how to safely certify those crew and all that. So that's where you can quickly get down this path of, well, it's not really a lease at that point because the person providing the airplane also probably provided the crew. Even if 2 checks are paid, I've heard that a lot, where as long as 2 checks are cut, one goes to the pilot and one goes to the aircraft owner, then that's legitimate. Again, that's a very sketchy thing to do. And in fact, not to bring up another advisory circular, but there is an AC called Truth in Leasing 9137B, a commercial pilot that is flying for someone that may be interested in leasing their aircraft really needs to look at that AC because it's very prescriptive on saying what the FAA expects. A truth in leasing document needs to be filed with the FSDO if the aircraft's over 12,500 pounds, for instance, and it gives you some example documentation there. So dry leases, again, I'm not saying they're all illegal or illegitimate. There's thousands of dry leases that are 100% fine. In fact, a lot of major airlines will lease their aircraft. So you might have a Delta Airlines aircraft that you've ridden on is actually a leased aircraft. And that's, again, wholly legitimate. But Joe off the street coming in to lease an aircraft is very rarely a legal thing. And it's really just a sham to try to get an illegal charter done.
Well, I guess the key message we have is for commercial pilots to watch out for any of these type of schemes and to make sure that the people you're working for are doing things legitimately.
Yeah, ask those questions. Ask, how did this person get in the back of the airplane? That's kind of the base question that I want to ask. And if they were invited by somebody, then I could potentially be holding out or passively participating and holding out, and it's not legal. So yeah, watch out for those.
Good. As we start to wrap up here, any other final thoughts on expense sharing and illegal charter?
Well, there's a lot of things that are complicated in terms of the FAA rules, but go out there. I would recommend the 3 advisory circulars that people look at. The cost sharing is what I would start with, 61-142. That's sharing aircraft operating expenses in accordance with 61-113. So that AC is a relatively new one. It's well written and I think very clear. And that covers everybody because as far as cost sharing goes, you could abuse cost sharing as a commercial pilot because you might think you're operating under your commercial pilot, but you're really operating under your private pilot's license. And an ATP holder can do the same thing. You can exercise private privileges and abuse cost sharing even as an ATP rated commercial pilot. So don't think that, well, I'm a commercial pilot or I'm an ATP pilot, I don't need to worry about cost sharing anymore. That's not the case. You still definitely need to understand that. So that's a really good advisory circular to read. And then the next one I would recommend is that Truth in Leasing document, the 9137B. That's a really good source of information if you're a commercial pilot and your aircraft owner is thinking about leasing an aircraft out. That would be something that I would say you definitely need to read into.
Excellent. Well, before we go, I wanted to ask you about one other thing. Tell us about your new podcast.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, I've got a podcast. You can search for it under VSL Aviation. And I'm going through, one of the reasons I'm talking about this now is I'm going through all of the airman certification standards from private all the way through instructor and ATP. And I just started the commercial pilot series. So I've covered Area of Operation 1, which is basically the oral. And I make these standalone podcasts that kind of give amplifying remarks about some of the more complex subjects. So in my instrument series, I did one, a standalone on weather, and I did a standalone on how to use your iPad for your instrument check ride. So you can look at the podcast for that if you're approaching a check ride. I think it has good content, and it'll help you understand a little bit better from the DPE standpoint how that check ride is going to go and how we structure the check ride and use the airman certification standards to conduct a check ride.
Seth, thanks so much for joining us here again today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Max. It's always good to be here.
And my thanks to Seth for joining us today and talking about expense sharing and illegal charters. If you want to read more about Seth and about getting a multi-engine rating at his flight school in Arkansas, which is VSL Aviation, check out his website at vsl.aero, and I'll have a link to his website, including to his podcast, in our show notes. And a big thank you to everyone who helps support this show, whether it's telling your friends about the show. And if you haven't done that, please tell them today about this show because they can probably learn something from it. And also, of course, thanks to people who write into us with emails and questions, people who leave us 5-star reviews on their podcast players, and people who contribute through Patreon and PayPal. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.